In 1968, two of the most respected scientists in the world examined what they believed was the body of a creature that is not supposed to exist. They studied it for 3 days. One of them was so convinced that he gave it a brand new scientific name, a new species of human being, alive in the modern world. When the scientists leaned in close to study the thing frozen in that block of ice, one of them, a trained naturalist who had stood over more dead animals than almost anyone alive, caught the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh seeping out of the case. Decay, death, the smell of something that had once been alive and was now breaking down. In 1968, in a refrigerated trailer hauled around the county fairs of the American Midwest, two of the most respected scientists in the world examined the body of a creature that, as far as science is concerned, is not supposed to exist. 6 feet long, covered head to foot in dark hair, lying on its back in the ice, one arm broken clean through the skin, one eye shot out of its skull. And these two men did not glance at it and walk away laughing. They studied it for 3 days, they sketched it, they photographed it, and one of them was so convinced by what he saw that he went home and gave it a brand new scientific name, formally declaring it a new species of human being alive in the modern world. In more than 100 years, nobody has ever produced a body, a whole one, the one thing that would end the argument forever. Except that for a few months, somebody had exactly that. A complete body on ice, certified as genuine by 2 of the founding fathers of an entire science. But it was stolen. Somebody did not want a Bigfoot body seen by the world. Somebody did not want it known, proven, photographed, cataloged, impossible to deny, that there is a living relative of the human race still out there in the trees. And so, at the very moment that the thing all of us have been chasing for 100 years was finally lying on a table where it could be studied, it was pulled out of reach and made to disappear. The most important biological discovery of the century, here one season and gone the next. Before we talk about who took it and why, you need to understand what they took. You need to understand where this body came from in the first place. Because the story of how it ended up frozen in a block of ice on a Minnesota farm is, if anything, stranger than the body itself. It starts, like so many of these stories do, with a man alone in country where he had no business being. The details that survive are thin and they shift depending on who is telling them, and that, all on its own, should make the hair on your arms stand up. Because men do not usually lie about where they were unless something happened they're worth lying about. But the thread that runs through every version is the same. Somewhere far from anywhere, a frozen forest on the far side of the world, by some accounts, a jungle in a war zone. By others, a living creature was hunted, and it was killed. Picture it the way the oldest version of the story asks you to. Deep cover, no roads, no help within 100 miles. Whoever was out there was not expecting company. And then, moving through the trees, something enormous. Upright, covered in hair, but with a face too close to our own to be any animal anyone could name. Not a bear, not an ape. Something in between, something that looked back at the hunter with eyes that understood. They say it was shot. Once, through the eye. They say it did not go down clean. They say there was a struggle in the cold, an arm broken, before the thing that should not exist finally stopped moving in the snow. And here's where a sane man's mind starts to bend, because you do not bury a thing like that. You do not walk away from it. You have, lying at your feet, the single most valuable object on the planet, proof, actual proof, of something humanity has whispered about since before we had a written language. So you do the only thing you can. You find a way to keep it cold. You find a way to get it home. And you start running because some part of you already knows that the moment the wrong people learn what you are carrying, it will be taken from you and you will be told very firmly that you never saw anything at all. How it traveled, who paid for it, how many hands it passed through before it ended up under glass in that humming refrigerated trailer. Those details dissolve the closer you look at them, the way these things always seem to. What we know is where it surfaced: a quiet Minnesota farm, a refrigerated trailer, and a frozen creature that its keeper could never quite explain, and, as it would turn out, never quite dared to let anyone examine too closely. This is the story of the Minnesota Iceman, and to understand why it still keeps people up at night more than 50 years later, we have to go back to the very beginning. His name was Frank Hansen. He was a former Air Force pilot turned Minnesota farmer, an ordinary-seeming man from an ordinary stretch of the upper Midwest. And sometime in the late 1960s, Frank Hansen started hauling a refrigerated trailer around the regional fair and livestock show circuit. Inside that trailer, lit up and laid out under glass, was his attraction. He charged admission to see it, a quarter a head, exactly the way you'd pay to gawk at the world's largest steer or a two-headed calf in a jar. And people lined up in the cold and filed past it, one after another, all season long. The story he told about the thing changed depending on when and where you caught the show. And this is one of the first details you have to wrestle with. Early on, he billed it as the Sibirskoish creature, dangling the idea that it was some ancient thing dredged up out of the Siberian permafrost on the far side of the world. Other times, the banner out front promised a man left over from the Ice Age, a survivor from the time of mammoths. Other times still, it was simply the missing link itself, the long-sought half-ape, half-man that science had been chasing ever since Darwin lit the fuse. Now, I'll be honest with you, the way this channel always tries to be, a story that keeps rewriting its own origins, is exactly the kind of thing a traveling showman makes up on the fly to keep the crowd interested. That is a tell. It's the behavior of a man selling tickets, and we are going to keep it firmly in mind as we go. But before you let that settle the matter, hold it up against the other possibility, because this case refuses to make it easy. What if the shifting names weren't a con man improvising, but a frightened man holding on to something he genuinely couldn't explain and could not legally account for, throwing out one cover story after another precisely to keep anyone from looking too hard at where it really came from? Both readings fit the same facts, and that ambiguity is baked right into the heart of the exhibit because of one brilliant, decisive choice Hansen made. He froze it in ice, and that single decision did two jobs at the same time. The ice made the creature more dramatic, more ancient, more convincingly frozen out of time, like something science would actually find sealed in a glacier. And this is the crucial part. The ice made the thing impossible to examine. You could look at it all you wanted. You could press right up to the glass, but you could not touch it. You could not take a sample. You could not turn it over or test the hair or cut into the tissue or run anything under a microscope. The very medium that made it spectacular was also the perfect shield against anyone ever proving what it was. And the timing of it mattered too. This was the late 1960s, a moment when the whole idea of missing links and ancient survivors and undiscovered creatures was alive in the popular imagination in a way it's hard to fully recapture now. The space race was on. The world still felt like it had unexplored corners. A frozen man-beast from the dawn of time, touring the heartland in a refrigerated trailer, didn't land in 1968 the way it might land today as obvious kitsch. It landed as a genuine maybe. People came primed to half believe, and Hansen, whatever else he was, understood exactly how to feed that hunger without ever quite letting anyone close enough to kill it. One of those people in line was a young man named Terry Cullen. He was a college student and an aspiring naturalist, and he caught the exhibit at the International Livestock Exposition in Chicago. He paid his quarter like everybody else and filed past the block of ice with the rest of the crowd. But Terry Cullen did not walk back out, shrugging it off as just another sideshow gimmick. Something about the thing in the ice got into him like a hook under the skin, and it would not let go. Because Cullen knew animals, he had the eye. And the longer he studied the frozen figure, the less it looked to him like the usual carnival garbage. The dried up Fiji mermaid stitched together from a monkey's torso and a fishtail, the obvious papier-mâché monsters, the painted plaster fakes that fell apart under any real scrutiny. This was different. The proportions looked wrong in a way that felt, to a trained eye, eerily right. The detail looked too good, too anatomically consistent to be a quick fairground prop. So Cullen did what any genuinely curious, serious-minded young naturalist would do. He tried to get a real scientist to come and look at it, and he slammed straight into a wall. He reached out to mainstream academics, the kind of people you'd think would be desperate to investigate a potential anatomical bombshell, and not one of them would bite. Nobody wanted to put their name, their credibility, their career within 100 miles of a frozen ape man parked at a livestock fair. The reputational risk was all downside. This is a pattern you'll recognize instantly if you've spent any time with this channel. The credible, sober witness practically waving his arms over his head, and the very experts who should be most curious turning their backs and walking the other way. But Cullen was stubborn in the best way. He kept pushing, and eventually his persistence paid off because he reached exactly the right man, Evan T. Sanderson. And here is where the entire story turns on a single coincidence so improbably neat that it almost sounds like something a screenwriter invented. When Cullen's tip finally reached Sanderson, Sanderson happened right at that moment to have a house guest staying with him. That house guest was Bernard Heuvelmans. So the message about a frozen humanoid creature at a Chicago fair didn't just land in front of one of the most famous naturalists in America. It landed on the very same day under the very same roof, in front of the two men who had essentially invented the modern scientific study of unknown animals, the two people on the entire planet most likely to take it seriously and most equipped to evaluate it. They were sitting in the same house. They read the tip together, and they decided then and there to drive out to Minnesota and see it for themselves. I want to slow all the way down here because the entire weight of this story, every ounce of why it still matters, why it isn't just another forgotten sideshow tale, rests on who these two men actually were. So let me lay out their credentials properly because the title of this video makes a promise about scientists, and I intend to cash that check honestly. Bernard Heuvelmans was a Belgian-French zoologist with a doctorate in his field, and he is very widely regarded as the father of cryptozoology itself, the scientific study of animals whose existence has not yet been formally proven. He didn't just dabble at the edges of it, he helped name and define the entire discipline. His major work on unknown animals was a serious, rigorous, heavily researched effort to drag the subject out of pure folklore and apply actual zoological standard to it, to sort the genuine biological mysteries from the campfire stories. So when a man like Heuvelmans looked at a specimen and said, "This could be real," it carried real weight, precisely because he had spent his whole career trying not to be fooled. Ivan Sanderson was cut from closely related cloth, a Scottish-American naturalist, an enormously prolific author, and a familiar, trusted face on American television as a popular science personality. He had founded his own research society devoted to investigating unexplained phenomena. He had written a serious, well-regarded book surveying the world's abominable snowmen legends. In the public mind of the late 1960s, Ivan Sanderson was a real scientist who happened to take strange things seriously, exactly the kind of credible authority whose word could move a story from the carnival tent into the newspaper's front section. Now, in the spirit of being completely straight with you, and being straight with you is the whole point of this channel, there is a genuine complication on Sanderson's side of the ledger, and I'm not going to bury it. Sanderson was also the science editor of a magazine called Argosy, a publication that mixed legitimate science reporting with frankly sensational, sell-the-issue material. That's a real credibility wrinkle. It means Sanderson had one foot planted in the rigorous scientific world and the other foot planted firmly in the world of, you won't believe what's frozen in this block of ice. So I personally think their combined credentials cut both ways, and the honest thing to say out loud is this. Being an expert did not make these men bulletproof. It did not make them immune to being fooled. If anything, the very thing that drew them to the case, the deep, career-long hope that something like this might really be out there, may have made them easier to fool, not harder. But, and this is the flip side that the skeptics never want to sit with, it also means that when these two specific men stood over that ice for 3 days and said the word genuine, that is not nothing. That is two of the most qualified human beings on the planet, in person, in the flesh, saying yes. They arrived at Frank Hansen's farm in southeastern Minnesota in the middle of December 1968. The creature was kept in its refrigerated trailer when it wasn't out on the road working the circuit. And over the course of roughly 3 days, somewhere around the 16th through the 18th of December, Sanderson and Heuvelmans conducted the closest thing to a genuine scientific examination that anyone before or since would ever be permitted to make. Now, understand the limits they were working under because they matter enormously for everything that follows. They could not dissect it. They could not, in any real sense, even touch it. The body was sealed inside a block of ice, behind glass, in a coffin-like case. So they did everything that those brutal constraints allowed. They made careful sketches. They photographed it in meticulous detail, lighting it and shooting it through the frozen, cloudy surface from every angle they could physically manage. They studied it the way you'd study a specimen you knew you might only get one shot at. And here's precisely what they recorded. And I want to be scrupulous here because this channel does not invent detail. I'm giving you only what is actually in their documented reports. Nothing embroidered, nothing imagined. An adult male, roughly 6 feet, about 1.8 meters in height. The entire body covered in dark brown hair, measured at roughly 3 to 4 inches long across most of its surface. It had clearly suffered violent trauma. One eye was destroyed, blown out of its socket, with a gaping associated wound, and one arm was broken so badly that bone had pushed up and out through the skin, a compound fracture. The kind of catastrophic injury that's hard to fake convincingly and hard to misread. The hands and the feet were strikingly large, and it was the hands more than anything that seized the attention of the two scientists. The thumb was slender, tapered, and long. The fingernails were flat, yellowed, and oddly, unsettlingly tidy, almost as though they had been manicured. And along the outer edge of the palm, there was a distinct heel-like pad, a feature Sanderson interpreted as a sign that this creature had habitually moved on all fours, the way a knuckle-walking primate might. These are not the observations of men glancing at a rubber suit. These are the notes of trained anatomists trying to read a body. There were details that to two trained eyes simply didn't read as fakery. The position of the body was strange and specific, not posed dramatically the way a sculptor building a monster for paying crowds would naturally arrange it, but awkward, twisted, contorted in the way a real body actually falls and freezes. The face behind its ruined eye had a slack, collapsed quality. The hair didn't grow in the uniform, evenly distributed way that fake fur is glued onto a costume. It followed the irregular patterns and whorls and bare patches that real hair follows on a real body. Heuvelmans, the more cautious and more rigorous of the two, kept circling back to the hands and the proportions, looking for the giveaway, the seam, the tell that would let him write the whole thing off, and he kept not finding it. But the single detail that did the most to convince them was not something they saw at all. It was something they smelled. Sanderson reported an appalling, unmistakable stench of rotting flesh seeping out from a particular point in the insulation around the coffin, the specific gut-level reek of decomposition. And I really want you to stop and sit with the weight of that, because it may be the most important sentence in this whole story. A latex model does not rot. A carved rubber prop does not rot. A sculpted, painted figure of a Neanderthal does not, under any circumstances, produce the smell of decaying meat. And yet a trained naturalist, a man who had stood over more real animal carcasses than almost anyone alive, was standing right there next to this thing and reporting the smell of death coming off of it. He didn't note it as a curiosity. He noted it as confirmation, as the sensory proof, beyond the photographs and the sketches, that whatever was in that ice had once been flesh. They were working through a permanent barrier of ice the entire time. They never once put a scalpel to it, never took a sample, never breached the surface. They left Minnesota with nothing in their hands but drawings, photographs, and the memory of that smell. And still, through the glass, through the frost, over 3 full days of the closest study anyone would ever be allowed, both of these credentialed men came away genuinely, professionally, reputation-stakingly certain that they were looking at the real thing, not a maybe, not a probably, certain. And they went home to 2 different continents prepared to tell the world. Heuvelmans went home to Belgium and did the single most consequential thing that anyone did in this entire affair, the move that turned a fairground curiosity into a permanent scientific scandal. In February of 1969, he published a formal scientific paper in the Bulletin of the Royal Institute of Natural Sciences of Belgium. Read that again. A real, peer-respected institutional scientific journal. And in that paper, he described the frozen creature as a new species. He gave it a formal Latin binomial name, Homo pongoides. Translated loosely, it means ape-like man. And later, Heuvelmans refined and sharpened the claim even further, arguing that what he had examined in that Minnesota trailer was, specifically, a form of Neanderthal, a cousin of modern humans we'd long believed extinct that had somehow survived undetected into the modern world. Sit with the sheer, breathtaking audacity of that for a moment. A credentialed zoologist, a founder of his field, formally proposed a brand new species of the human genus, a living relative of you and me, surviving into the 20th century. And he hung that proposal on a corpse he had studied through a sheet of ice in a carnival trailer parked on a Minnesota farm. There's no comfortable, hedged middle ground available here. That claim is either one of the boldest and most important scientific declarations of the entire century, or it is one of the most spectacular and embarrassing mistakes a serious scientist has ever committed to print. It has to be one or the other. And Sanderson, for his part, made absolutely certain that the wider world heard about it. He wrote the story up for Argosy magazine in the spring of 1969, posing the question right there on the page, was this, at last, the missing link between man and the apes? And his language was about as unhedged as a scientist's language ever gets. He wrote that a single look had been enough to convince them this was, in his own phrase, the genuine article, and emphatically no phony trick and no piece of artwork. He even saddled the creature with a nickname, Bozo, which is, when you think about it, a deeply strange and almost flippant thing to call something you sincerely believe to be a dead human ancestor. And he didn't stop at the printed page. Ivan Sanderson took the story to television. He sat across from Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show during the holiday season and told a national audience of millions about the frozen man waiting in a trailer in Minnesota. There was also a darker, stranger thread running underneath the entire spectacle, a persistent rumor about where the body had supposedly come from. The whisper was that the creature had been shot and killed in Vietnam during the war by an American serviceman and then smuggled back into the United States, hidden away. I want to be very careful and very clear here, because this is exactly the kind of unverifiable claim this channel handles with a light touch. That origin story is a rumor, full stop. It is unconfirmed, and it shifted and mutated over the years, just like every other story Hansen told. But it is woven into the mythology of the case, and it matters for one specific reason. It plants a question that is going to come back to haunt the skeptics later on. Why on earth would a man invent and then attach to himself a backstory that, if anyone believed it, would make him a criminal? Here's the thing about getting famous when you got something to hide. Frank Hansen wanted crowds. He wanted lines out the door and quarters piling up in the till. What he very much did not want was scrutiny. And the moment Heuvelmann's scientific paper and Sanderson's splashy Argosy article hit, followed by that Tonight Show appearance, Hansen got the second thing whether he wanted it or not, in a flood he could not control. The story ran in newspapers around the world. Suddenly, improbably, mainstream science was taking a carnival sideshow seriously. And that, not failure, not exposure, but success, turned out to be the single worst thing that could possibly have happened to Frank Hansen. On the 13th of March, 1969, the Smithsonian Institution, the Smithsonian, the most powerful and prestigious scientific body in the United States, formally wrote to Hansen and requested permission to inspect and X-ray the specimen. They brought in their own expert to handle the evaluation, a highly respected primatologist named John Napier, a serious anatomist with an unimpeachable reputation. This is the establishment itself knocking on the trailer door. This is the precise, golden moment that any true believer should have been praying for. The moment the most credible scientific institution in the country says, in effect, "All right, show us. Let us bring it in. Let us put it under the X-ray machine and run the tests and settle this thing once and for all in front of the whole world." And Frank Hansen said no. He refused the Smithsonian outright. And then he went further. He stated in writing that the owner of the creature had reclaimed and removed the original specimen, that it would never be put on exhibition again, and that going forward it would be replaced by an admitted man-made model for the coming show season. And then Hansen, along with his exhibit, simply vanished off the circuit for a stretch. Now think hard about why that refusal carries so much weight, why it sits at the very center of this whole mystery. There was, by this point, a real and growing fear that the thing in the ice might be an actual human corpse. And if it was a genuine dead human being, then this stopped being a quirky curiosity and instantly became a possible serious crime, a body being trucked across state lines and displayed for profit. Look at the asymmetry there, because it's everything. A fake just gets you laughed at and moves you down the road to the next town. A real body gets you investigated and possibly arrested. And Hansen, standing at the exact threshold where the most powerful microscope in the country was finally being aimed at his attraction, chose to pull the entire thing out of reach and disappear. When Frank Hansen resurfaced later in 1969, he had a creature in the ice once again. But it was not quite the same creature. People who had seen the earlier version and who looked closely at the new one started noticing differences, small but real. The figure was now posed in a way that revealed more detail than before. For instance, you could now see teeth through slightly parted lips, where previously the mouth had been positioned differently. Hansen's explanation for the whole thing was clean and convenient, and impossible to check. The real one, he said, had been quietly reclaimed by its mysterious owner, a wealthy Californian he would never name and never produce. And what you were now paying your quarter to look at was a model, a replica, a faithful stand-in for the genuine article, which was gone forever beyond anyone's reach. This swap is the absolute heart of the not what anyone expected turn. So let's lay the competing explanations out side by side, cleanly and fairly. John Napier, the Smithsonian's man, dug into the whole affair with the cold eye of an investigator, and he reached a deflating, deeply unromantic conclusion. Napier came to believe that the so-called model was in fact probably the original, the very same object, simply thawed out, subtly rearranged into a slightly different pose, and then refrozen. Something, he noted, that could easily have been accomplished during a vacation Hansen conveniently took in the spring of 1969, right in the window between the Smithsonian's request and his reappearance. In other words, in Napier's reading, there had never been any swap at all. There was just one single object the entire time, and that one object was man-made from the start. Napier even ran down a lead suggesting the figure had been manufactured by a company out on the West Coast around 1967, before the show ever hit the road. And there's a detail in the timing that the believers have never let go of. The differences people noticed in the second version weren't all in the direction you'd expect. If Hansen had simply commissioned a fresh, improved model to dodge the Smithsonian, you might expect it to be better, more refined, more convincing. But some who saw both came away feeling the later one was subtly off, a degree more artificial, as though something had been lost in the transition. To the skeptics, that's just the difference between handling the original prop and rushing a replacement. To the believers, it's the ghost of exactly what Heuvelmans claimed, that a real specimen had been pulled out and something else slotted into its place. The same observation pointing in two opposite directions, depending entirely on what you already believe. That is the Minnesota Iceman in a single sentence. Now I want to hand the floor to the skeptics, fully and fairly, and let their case stand at its full strength, because it is a strong case, and you deserve to hear it without me quietly leaning on the scale. John Napier said something about this affair that was as sharp as it was memorable. He said the Minnesota Iceman was a problem for a detective agency, not for a biologist. And the truth is, when you look at it as a detective problem, the whole thing reads almost suspiciously clean. Look at the entire sequence from the skeptic's chair, step by step. You commission a convincing, anatomically careful figure. You freeze it in a block of ice, a move that conveniently makes it simultaneously more dramatic to look at and completely impossible to examine. You take it on the road and you leak a few tantalizing, contradictory rumors about its origins to build mystique and draw in the press and the experts. And then, the very instant the real authorities show up with X-ray machines and serious questions, you announce that the genuine article has been spirited away by an unnamed, unreachable millionaire, and you slot in a model that just so happens to be more or less identical to what people saw before. Every single move in that chain is precisely exactly what a brilliant and careful showman would do. And it's worth stating plainly that Hansen himself, across the years, offered up several different and flatly contradictory stories about where the creature came from. Vietnam, Siberia, a workshop in Hong Kong, and more. Those contradictions are not the marks of a man protecting a real secret. They are exactly what you would expect from a man inventing the story as he went along, retrofitting the legend whenever a new version sold better. And the hardest skeptical point of them all is also the simplest, and there's no getting around it. No one ever tested the thing, not once, not ever. No X-ray was ever taken, no tissue sample was ever extracted. No DNA, no dissection, no analysis of the hair, nothing. The word proof sitting in the title of this video was never proof in the actual scientific sense. It could not be, because the one single thing that could have transformed it into proof, genuine physical access to the body, is the precise thing that Frank Hansen never, under any circumstances, allowed to happen. And so, weighed strictly and soberly on the available evidence, the cautious, responsible verdict is the deflating one. The Minnesota Iceman was, in all likelihood, a carnival hoax. A brilliant one, maybe the best one ever staged, but a hoax. So that is the case for fake, laid out at full strength. But this channel does not stop where the skeptics stop, because if we're honest, there are loose threads here that the tidy hoax explanation simply does not tie off. Start with that smell. The stench of genuine rot, of decaying flesh, that a trained naturalist, a man who knew exactly what a real carcass smells like, swore was coming directly off the thing. That is the one detail a rubber model has no earthly business producing, and the skeptics have never really explained it away. They mostly just step around it. Then there's the strange self-incrimination buried in the backstory. If you're simply inventing a fake creature out of nothing, why would you ever saddle yourself with an origin story about shooting a living thing and smuggling a body home? A story that, if anyone took it seriously, could land you in a courtroom? Hoaxers invent stories that protect them, not stories that expose them. And then, towering over all of it, there is Bernard Heuvelmans himself, a serious man, a careful man, a man whose entire professional reputation was built on the foundation of not being gullible, of being the one who applied rigor where others applied wishful thinking. This is the man who looked at that body up close for 3 days and then went to his grave decades later, still insisting the original was real. Ivan Sanderson blinked. Heuvelmans, the more rigorous of the two, never did. And you have to decide for yourself what it means that the harder-nosed, more skeptical of the two founding scientists was the one who absolutely refused to back down. And if you have followed this strange field for any real length of time, the shape of this story should feel sickeningly, almost painfully familiar by now, because the Minnesota Iceman is not some freak, isolated, one-off oddity. It is the purest, most concentrated, most distilled example of a pattern that haunts this entire subject like a curse. The pattern in which we get achingly, heartbreakingly close to a real, testable, physical specimen. And then, at the very last possible second, it slips straight through our fingers and is gone. Think about the timing of it for a moment. All of this is unfolding in the very same narrow window, 1967, 1968, as the Patterson-Gimlin film, the most famous strip of Bigfoot footage ever shot, which mainstream science also flatly refused to seriously engage with. The two biggest pieces of physical Bigfoot evidence of the century landing almost on top of each other, and the establishment turning away from both. And we have covered on this channel the long and deeply frustrating history that surrounds all of it. The plaster casts that get waved off, the hair samples that come back maddeningly inconclusive, the Ketchum DNA study that promised the world and convinced almost no one, the audio recordings that analysts have now spent decades arguing over without resolution. Over and over and over, the same thing happens. The evidence claws its way right up to the threshold of genuine proof, and then there is a swap, a loss, a refusal, a sample that mysteriously degrades, an owner who suddenly won't permit the test. The door slams shut just as the light comes on. I personally think that recurring vanishing act is the real reason the Iceman still grips people more than 50 years later. The reason we're still talking about a fairground exhibit from 1968. It isn't just a weird story about a frozen ape man at a county fair. It's the whole tragedy of this field captured in miniature, frozen in a single block of ice. The closer this kind of evidence ever gets to being truly provable, the faster it seems to disappear. If you find that pattern as endlessly fascinating and as endlessly maddening as I do, then subscribe and stick around, because chasing down exactly these kinds of cases is the entire reason this channel exists. And this one connects directly to someone I've been wanting to cover properly for a long time now. Tom Slick, a real Texas oil millionaire who poured an actual fortune into funding genuine, serious expeditions to hunt for these creatures all over the world. Hold on to that name, because the idea of a mysterious, fabulously wealthy backer secretly bankrolling the search for a monster isn't only Frank Hansen's convenient cover story. For Tom Slick, it was simply real life. That deep dive is coming. So what actually happened to the thing itself, to the physical object at the center of all this? The figure that Hansen toured for years, the one that the great majority of investigators are convinced was the only object that ever truly existed, did not simply evaporate into thin air when the publicity died down. Over the following decades, it changed hands and went quiet, dropping out of the public eye for a long stretch. And then, years later, it resurfaced. It has been put back on public display in more recent times, turning up in collections and exhibitions where curious people can, in fact, walk right up and stand in front of the famous, infamous Minnesota Iceman with their own two eyes. So, in a strange and roundabout way, the instinct behind a title like, "Here's where you can go see it," isn't entirely wrong after all. There genuinely is an object out there in the world that you can travel to and look at. But, and this is the entire point, the whole twist of the knife, what you would be looking at is, by very nearly every serious account, the model, the display piece, the replica. The exact thing the skeptics insist was always the only thing that ever existed in the first place. The original, the one that Hubelmans examined for 3 days, the one he staked his reputation on and named as a new species of human, the one that supposedly reeked of real decay through 4 inches of ice. That one, if it was ever real at all, has never been recovered, has never been tested, and has never been seen again. It is simply gone. You can go and see the legend. You cannot go and see the proof. So let's go back one last time to exactly where we started, back to that humming refrigerated trailer parked behind a fairground in the deep cold of the winter of 1968. The body lying on its back in the block of ice, the one massive arm thrown up and over the ruined, blown-out face, and the single good eye staring straight up through 4 inches of cloudy frost at a slow line of strangers in heavy winter coats, shuffling past at a quarter ahead. Lay the two endings side by side and look at them honestly, because in the end, that is genuinely all that any of us can do. On the one side, the greatest carnival hoax of the 20th century, a figure so good, so anatomically convincing, that it fooled the 2 men who founded the very science of monsters frozen in ice precisely so that no one could ever prove it false, and then swapped out at the exact perfect moment that the truth was finally within reach. And on the other side, the one single time in all of recorded history that somebody actually caught one of these things, laid it out on ice, let 2 real and credentialed scientists study it for 3 full days and then lost it, or hid it, or had it taken away, before the world's most powerful microscope could ever once be aimed at it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you which one of those is the truth, because the honest answer, the only honest answer, is that nobody on Earth can. but I will leave you with the 3 things about this case that keep me awake at night. The smell of rot that a trained naturalist swore on his reputation was real, the one thing no model on Earth could ever produce. The scientific name Homo pongoides still sitting there to this very day in the pages of a 1969 Belgian journal, never formally retracted. A brand new species of human being cataloged for science on the strength of a body in a fairground freezer. And one careful, hard-nosed, credentialed scientist who had every reason in the world to quietly walk the whole thing back, to protect what was left of his good name, and who instead chose to insist until the very day he died that the thing in the ice had been real. The body is gone now. The ice melted away half a century ago. And what it truly was, a brilliant, perfect fraud, or the one that finally got away, comes down, in the end, entirely to which scientist you choose to believe. Sleep on that one.